Now it's Deborah Kobylt Live and the Little Italy podcast.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me today on our Little Italy podcast and Deborah Kobylt Live. Gosh, I am so honored to welcome to our show Gino Gaudio, president of the Tony Gaudio Foundation, and also brothers Fabrizio Nucci and Alessandro Nucci, who just flew in recently from Cosenza, Italy, joining us because they are working on the beautiful film about the life of Tony Gaudio, the first Italian to receive an Oscar. It is a brilliant story. I'm honored to be just a small part in telling this story. All of you, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Deborah, for
Absolutely.
having us.
Oh,
Thank you. It's a
absolutely.
pleasure.
Of course. Now, who wants to go first? Who would like to tell me about Tony Gaudio? Perhaps you, Gino, you share the same last name. Would you please?
Yes, I will. There were two brothers that came from Cosenza, Italy in 1906, roughly. They came to New York. There's Tony and Eugene Gaudio. My grandfather, Tony Gaudio, was my great uncle. They started working out in the labs, and then when production transferred to the West Coast, they came west. And so they, in the early days, they began in the silent era with their filming and made the transition. Tony made the transition. The Gaudio family had a tradition dating back to 1857 in Cosenza, Italy, where they had portrait studios. And so they learned their craft back in Cosenza. My grandfather died in 1920. Tony Gaudio lived on to become just a giant in the motion picture industry, primarily with Warner Brothers. He created a lot of effects. And he was nominated 6 times for the Academy Award and won once for Anthony Adverse in 1937.
Yeah, that is a brilliant film. I looked it up, and what an incredible film. Now, let me talk to both of you, Fabrizio and Alessandro. You're from the town where Tony is from, and I know that there's a plaque that now memorializes him there. We'll get into that a little later. But talk to me about his journey way back in the day, in the early part of the 1900s, working in Cosenza, because I know that people are still talking about his legacy there. Talk to me, please.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story because Gaetano, Tony Gaudio, was born in Cosenza, at the same town we were born. And he traveled away from Cosenza, Calabria, from the south of Italy. He's supposed to work in Piemonte too, for one of the major and the first production company of Italy, Ambrosio Film in Turin. And then he moved to USA in 1906, starting his American dream with this journey, first in New York, then in Los Angeles. And then he started his brilliant career in cinema with all his innovations in cinema about techniques of how to light the scene, how to light the movies. And so it's a pleasure and an honor for us telling this story, not just because of this important figure, but also because Tony was from the same city of us. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to tell this story that someone knows, especially here in America, but in Italy is not so a new person. Because his story may be missing during the time, as his statuette, because his statuette, his 1937 statuette has been lost, and so now we are here for shooting, but also for trying to find this statuette somewhere.
Right. Who are you working in conjunction with where you're going to be shooting? Because I know you have various locations throughout Los Angeles. You're also going to be in New York. Talk to us about that. Anybody can jump in at this point.
Yes, we are shooting here in LA, and we have already done some beautiful interviews. For example, we have been to the clubhouse of the American Society of Cinematographers, and we have interviewed great cinematographers. For example, we have had the pleasure and the honor to have Richard Edlund with us. It's a name that not everybody knows, but I can just name a few title of his career: Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Wow.
very unknown small movies. So it was
Absolutely.
a giant honor for us to interview Richard Edlund, one of the biggest special effects experts. And actually, you know, Deborah, it's a nice coincidence because the very first short movie that Tony he filmed when he arrived in New York in 1906. Actually, the first short is from 1909. It's a
Oh,
beautiful short movie, an animated short movie full of effects. For example, stop motion. It's a story of a little fairy contained in a bottle, and then a big guy breaks the bottle, and you see this little fairy coming out of the bottle. So full of special effects. And we showed this clip to Richard Edlund to check his reaction. It was very nice, very funny. Uh, and so, you know, it's a brilliant career. Tony Gaudio shot so many movies. Someone says 1,000, maybe exaggerating, but
oh,
at least 100 movies. And in a
Yes.
career, it's a lot because, you know, today it's impossible for a cinematographer to shoot 100 movies in his career. But at the time, with the studio system, you know, it was more kind of a you know, like the car industry. They shot one film after the other very fast, and so a
right.
cinematographer could experience so many different movies in his career. Maybe he could shoot like five, four, six movies in just 1 year, working with
Yeah.
many stars and especially with Betty Davis.
Yeah. And I know he was also very well known to also the way he lit the films, right? Because back then, I remember once going to the New Jersey home of, oh gosh, who was it? Was it Thomas Edison? I don't recall, where they were showing how, they would move the sets to capture the lighting above, right? So he had to work with all that way back in the day, right? So he was really so ahead of himself. Again, anybody jump in about his craft, about how ahead of himself he was, and how he very quickly got notice here by the American film societies, right?
Yeah, yeah. For example, Tony Gaudio started to work in a period. He was a pioneer somehow because he started, as I told you, in 1909. So cinema was at its beginning, we can say, the first couple of decades of cinema history. And actually, here in the United States, the cinema industry didn't start in Los Angeles, but in New York,
That's
and
right.
uh, and he started to work there, and then he moved to LA in maybe 1915, more or less. And at the time, the lighting techniques were very basic, and
Right.
the most important thing in movies was to have an exposure, so everything has to be lit properly. Everything was to be very bright, and especially the actors, especially the actresses, has to be very well lit, and everything was a little bit flat. At the same time, in
Hmm.
Europe, there was the German expressionism, and they were already experimenting a lot with lights. But here in Hollywood, in New York, and then in Hollywood, the lighting was a little bit flat and not very interesting. And people like Tony Gaudio started to experiment with lighting, and they started to play with dark, with the light, with the shadows. It was very well ahead of time. For example, in these movies, you could see the faces of the actresses. Sometimes they were coming from the darkness, and then they moved to light. You could see, for example, half of the faces in darkness and the half of the face in light. It was so ahead of time at the time, especially because
Yeah.
studio system had a big control over movies. So it was you had to be a little bit of an outsider to experiment with light that way. And at the same time, he could also give a great value to the faces of the actresses. For example, Betty Davis, at some point, she said that he just wanted Tony Gaudio for her movies. She didn't want any other cinematographers because Betty Davis was had a very
A diva, a diva.
was a diva, but she had a particular face, so she really cared a lot about the way she looked. And Tony Gaudio was great with her, and after many years, she still remembered the way she looked in those movies.
No, well, lighting really is sort of everything, right? I mean, without this lighting, let's just say the right lighting just makes you look a whole lot better, right? I mean, um, Gino, let's talk
Yeah.
a little bit about some of the very well-known people that now we just heard about Bette Davis, but also didn't he work with Greta Garbo? Because I do know that people asked for him. They said, look, I'll do this film, but you've got to get
Yeah.
Tony Gaudio on board. I know that he worked with, I believe, Howard Hughes. I mean, so many infamous figures in early film. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I know that he worked, like you say, I know that he worked with Bette Davis. Primarily, that's the biggest star that I know of that he worked with. He worked with Errol Flynn.
Yeah.
He worked with all of the major stars, but he was very well known and asked for. As far as the actual people, maybe Alessandro or Fabrizio have a better handle on exactly which stars, but he as far as one of the things I wanted to mention to you is that he did develop a lighting technique where he was able to light from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So he was very, very innovative in what he was doing.
Right. And from what I understand, I mean, that did start at such a young age. I mean, creativity like that develops, but you're also born with it too. And clearly he even experimented a little just when he was young and working in Cosenza, right? So you could go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when I went back in September when the plaque that you were talking about, Alessandro and Fabrizio set up a red carpet event that involved local government, involved a lot of people, journalists, people that wrote about it, the film commissions and so forth. And so there were a lot of people that all of a sudden now they've had this ongoing interest, and now they have a focal point where they can focus this interest. And so when we were there, you're talking about the history and how they learned their craft. Well, their older brother, Raffaele, ran the photo studio. And when we were back there in Cosenza, we went to a museum that had pictures. There were panoramic pictures that Raffaele had done of construction of a bridge back in the early 1900s. So you can imagine the process that he went through with the ambient lighting and setting up for a panoramic shot of this bridge construction. So I think even back in the day, I think they had a family history of innovation. And then they brought that to this country. And I know just from a family standpoint, I know we've heard all of the stories about Tony Gaudio and the lost Oscar, just in terms of sitting around the table at parties and so forth. But it's all been, I'm learning so much from Fabrizio and from Alessandro, all the detail about his life from people who actually understand the significance of what he contributed in the early days, and bringing forward the artistry from the Italian community within which they grew up. It was important to be an artist. It was important to have a refined sense of technique, and they brought that all to the United States and then to the West Coast.
I'd like to say the apple doesn't fall far from the family tree, because you're quite a performer, Gino, a beautiful singer. I mean, the first time I heard you open your mouth, I thought, oh my goodness, you perform throughout Los Angeles, festivals, etc. But I would just like to point that out to our audience, that you're pretty darn talented yourself. But let's get back to Tony for a moment. What's also very important about this story and about his work is how well received he was as an Italian at a time in our nation's history that often wasn't the case, right? I mean, they were lucky to find work. Very often, like my family, they were gardeners, which is fine. They started a business, etc. But he came in and he was well received among the elite, let's say, right? So let's talk about what he did for Italians in this country. Anybody?
Okay. Of course, Tony and Eugene were important not just for what they did in the cinema industry for the movies they shot, but also for the institution they contributed to build here. For example,
Right.
Eugene was one of the founders of American Society of Cinematographer, and Tony was one of the first president in the early days. So they contributed for about the Italian American community, also with other kind of work. So not just on the set, but also behind the set for building what we know nowadays is the cinema industry here in Los Angeles. So maybe
Right.
the contribution was also for making Italians, immigrants, important here, because they were not just workers, but they also contributed to build American society, and not only cinema industry, but also what we know Los Angeles is nowadays.
In fact, we are also collaborating with the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles, because telling about the Italian migration of those years is another important aspect of our documentary. So it's not only about cinema and the film industry and the cinematography techniques, but also a story of migration. And we would like to understand more about how Italians got to the United States, but especially why many of them migrated then from the East Coast to the West Coast. And there are many reasons. For example, here it's not so different from our hometown Cosenza, because we have the sea, and not far from the sea we have the mountains, and the
That's right.
weather is not so extreme. And of course, there already at the beginning of last century, there was a nice, a great wine industry. So many Italians who already had some expertise in that field in their homeland. When they came here, they could continue to work here, and maybe they could be also accepted a little bit better here than on the East Coast, because when they got to New York, many of them ended doing very
Easy works,
easy work. They were somehow also a little bit poor, but when they came here, maybe their abilities, their skills could be much more useful, and so they had a great success on this side of the country.
I would say that he opened quite a few doors, right, for Italians to be working in this creative field. Would you say that?
Yes, and also, of course, since here there were already many people, for example, from Mexico, many Spanish, and they
Right,
have
right.
much in common. The language is not very different. Of course, the religion, because both Spanish and Italians are Catholics. And so when they came to California, maybe it was easier for them. They find like a second home that was not much different from Calabria.
So this is an interesting story, because we start right about his early life in Cosenza, and then we journey to New York, where he started working in the States. Then we come here, and he wins the Oscar. And when did he die? When did Tony pass away?
1951.
1951,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And again, the first Italian, not Italian American, but the first Italian to win an Oscar, which I think is extraordinary. And now it's gone. Right? It's gone. Hence,
Yeah.
hence the name, The Lost Oscar. I think it's just a fabulous and fascinating story about immigration, about the cinema industry, and showing our beautiful home country in Italy. But what are we doing to find this Oscar? How can we find it? Have you spoken to, let's say, the folks at the Academy to say, gosh, he won an Oscar, we're looking for it? Like, what are you doing to fill in that gap, if you will?
We are looking everywhere because we asked to the academy, of course, too, but maybe they don't have. And so also through Gino, we are trying to go back to the
family.
early, to the family, and to try to understand who can have this statuette, but maybe no one has. So we are asking ourselves, maybe where can Tony have put this Oscar in the last years of his life, because when he retired, he moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and then he went back to his early years, because he opened a photographic store in San Francisco, as the family photographic store they had in Cosenza. So we are trying to to think as Tony maybe thought in that years. And so we are looking around. Maybe we will find, but you have to watch our documentary.
We don't want to spoil anything.
No spoilers.
Deborah.
No, yes, sir.
Yeah, I can tell you that as far as the family is concerned, I know there's about 14 or 15 of us cousins that are getting together on Saturday. Ooh. All of our lives growing up, all of our lives, we've heard this story about Tony Gaudio, first Italian, win the Oscar. Where's the Oscar? It's been the family story history, the outstanding question of our family for 60 years. Where is the Oscar? And nobody knows where it is. You know, we have our theories. It might be in Texas with his second wife's family. But we really have absolutely no idea. We have some threads of contacts that we're going to follow up on, but it's really kind of an extraordinary story.
Oh, absolutely. You've got me curious. I want to go on a hunt. Really, like each one of us, we take a little section and see if we can find out where's the Oscar, the lost Oscar. Fabulous title of the documentary, by the way. But where was it last seen? Like, was there a picture of him and it was in the living room or something like that? Like somebody must have seen it. Like, oh, I remember he had it in the kitchen. I don't know, wherever you put an Oscar.
Actually,
go ahead, Fabrizio. Go ahead, Alessandro.
No, I just wanted to say that Tony's career, of course, is made of more than 100 movies. But the particular thing is that about his private life, we don't have many documents, because even if he was a photographer and a cinematographer, for example, we didn't used to take many pictures of his family, of himself at home. So actually, I think that the only picture of Tony with his Oscar is during the ceremony.
That's the only one I've ever seen.
I hope we didn't leave it at the restaurant. I mean, you know,
maybe forgot there. Yeah, in the toilet, maybe somewhere.
Oh my goodness, you guys are
taxi,
great.
Maybe.
Yeah. Tony is buried with some very notable people in Hollywood, right? At the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, Rudolph Valentino, to name a few, are there. I love that place, actually. You know, when I have friends come into town, I often take them there and the cemetery where Marilyn Monroe was buried. It's like, oh, come on, we're getting from the airport. We're going to take you to the cemetery. They're like, what? But there's so much history, right, in these cemeteries. Yeah. I just think that's beautiful. So that's one of the locations where you're also going, right?
Yeah, but for example, some days ago, we interviewed Marianna Gatto, the president of Italian American Museum of Los Angeles, and she told us that she used to do yoga session in that cemetery because it's so great location, and so we are excited to shoot there in a couple of days too.
Oh, that's exciting! That's absolutely wonderful.
That cemetery backs up to Paramount Studios.
Yes.
So it's in terms of location, and you can also see the Hollywood sign from there. And Tony Gaudio is buried there. Eugene Gaudio is buried there, and their mother is also buried there. And I have to say, with some pride, that my wife and I have a plot there.
Oh.
Next to near Tony Gaudio.
Wow, that's beautiful. Not yet, Gino. You got
not yet.
Later, much later.
Yeah.
Many decades to come, please, Gino.
Many decades to come, yeah.
Many decades to come. Before I let you all go, I'd like to also mention that Mary Reed is also producer on this film, because once the film is made and put together, I want to have you all back and talk to Mary as well, because I know she's been doing an extraordinary job on this. I mean, but again, this is a story of immigration. This is a story of a successful Italian. It's an important story. And I really could see Hollywood getting behind this. You know, the more you've got out there shooting this is really an exciting documentary. I'm just thrilled to be even a small part to be able to tell the story. I really am. Anything else? Please.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say that, from the family standpoint, obviously when you have a family member like this, you just focus on, yes, he won the Oscar and so forth. But in this process, having worked for like 2 or 3 years with Alessandro and Fabrizio, and going through this process, you realize that, this subject, it's important for the industry, as you're saying. In other words, the lost Oscar is kind of a metaphor, if you will, the lost, possibly the lost art or the lost recognition for the Italian contribution in the film industry. And
That's right.
It's also been and is a wonderful focal point for my family. I mean, this
That's
is
right.
uniting all of us cousins, around this idea that we've had forever and ever. What I'm trying to say, I think, is that this project will, I believe, unify both on a familial level and also in the industry in Los Angeles. It's a focal point that we've, as Italians and Americans, have been looking for, and I believe that it will be that for our community.
Well, isn't that what it's all about in our culture?
Yeah.
It's about the family, the good and the bad, right? The beautiful and the ugly. It's just sort of what we're all about as Italians. We're complicated people, right? And the fact that this man traveled so far and did so much in his life and career, and now is bringing together people so many years later in the year 2023 to talk about his story. Yes. You're right. This is a family story, and it's a beautiful one too. I want to also end by talking about the plaque that is dedicated in Cosenza and that you were there for personally, that you two were responsible for also getting off the ground. That is on what particular building? Would you tell us?
Fabrizio, why don't you, Alessandro, why don't you guys tell that story?
Because this building is in the whole part of our town of Cosenza, that now is an abandoned part of the city, unluckily. And so it was important for us to put this plaque on this building where the Gaudio's brothers, Raffaele, Eugene, and Tony, start their careers. Then Eugene and Tony moved to USA, Raffaele moved to Rome from Cosenza, and there started everything. And so this plaque was important for the memory of these three brothers, but also for our city, because that part of the city is full of story and of stories and full of history. And so for us, it was important to give back the memory of these three brothers to the city, and to make everyone knew this story.
And you know, Deborah, everybody in Cosenza has seen that Photo Gaudio sign on the top of that building 100 times in his life, but nobody knew why. Maybe everybody knew, maybe thought that it was just a old photo lab, but nobody could know that those Gaudios then became famous cinematographers, Academy Award winners. So it's very important also to give a new meaning, a new value to that sign, to that important place of the city, but that nobody really care a lot, because you just walk or drive close to that building without noticing too much.
Because we know
now.
The title of our documentary is The Lost Oscar, but not just for the statuette, because it's a lost story, the one of the Gaudios. And so we don't know if we will find the statuette, but we hope we will do the recovery of this memory. So it will be maybe a lost statuette, but not a lost story. We hope.
Yes.
No, it's
beautiful.
As Gino was saying, it's a story about family. And the Oscar is the metaphor where it's built around. So beautiful. I don't know who's scoring this documentary, but gosh, Gino, I sure hope you do a little singing on it, because I think your voice is so extraordinary. I think it would be incredibly appropriate. But
actually, he's already done it. In a scene, we shot a beautiful scene in Rome where Gino met one of his oldest relative, actually, and at some point he suddenly started to sing, surprising everybody, and it was a beautiful moment of the documentary.
It's extraordinary. No, I agree. The first time I heard him, I thought, "Oh, wow." So anyway, anything you'd all love to add, because we'll be talking to you as the project continues, because I'm sure lots will be unfolding about his life. I'm personally very interested. Anything you'd like to end with before we let you go?
I just wanted to add my great thanks to Fabrizio and Alessandro, because it's one of those things where they made a cold call to me. They reached out just because my last name is Gaudio, wondering if I might know something about Tony Gaudio. And that was 3 years ago. And it has blossomed into this wonderful friendship and relationship and bridge between California and Cosenza. And it's been just such a wonderful experience. And so just for everyone, I wanted to thank both of them for everything that they're doing.
Thank you, Gino.
Thank you,
Thank
Gino.
Beautiful.
And also, it is a project about resilience because we started to work on this project after the first lockdown in 2020, and we had to postpone multiple times this trip to the United States because, as you know, the flights were completely halted multiple times. There were travel restrictions during 2020, 2021. And so we are finally here, and it is like a dream because
and we don't want to leave.
At some point it's impossible.
Well, I look forward to meeting you both next week. I believe we're getting together, right, for a luncheon. And Gino and Mary, who's producing the film, I look forward to it. I look forward to, continuing with this story as you're filming it. I think who knows what kind of surprises we're going to uncover. So all of you, thank you for joining us. Gino Gaudio, Fabrizio, of course, Fabrizio, and the two of you, Alessandro, thank you so much for joining our shows. Just so anyone knows out there, our shows are live. They go out on Facebook and on YouTube. We will be posting promos on Instagram. And then as an audio podcast, you can listen to the podcast. Just look up our names, the Little Italy Podcast and Deborah Kobylt Live. And you'll find it wherever you get your audio and video podcasts. You'll be showing up. So thanks so much. Tell your friends, tell everybody. And we really appreciate all of you joining us. It's really been a pleasure. I'm your host, Deborah Zara Kobylt. So thanks for joining us, and please get in touch with us. Happy New Year, everybody. Bye-bye.